especially when you're an expert and you are so deep in the process design, you sometimes forget the people. Make sure that you communicate openly what you're doing, invite the people to participate.
Welcome to Process Pioneers, the show that takes a deep dive into the minds of decision makers, key influencers, and process experts who are pioneering the world of everything process. Welcome to the next episode of Process Pioneers. My name is Daniel Rayner. I'm the host of Process Pioneers. And in each of these episodes, if you're joining us for the first time in each of these episodes, I get this privilege of sitting down with various process practitioners, process specialists, process experts, anyone from the business process management realm. And we dig in, we ask questions, we find out what it takes to successfully and sustainably implement business process management in an organization. We are now up to approximately 160. I think it's 158, 159. I'm not entirely sure, but it's around that number. Been going for a couple of years now, and a lot of fantastic episodes there from some of the most brilliant minds in the process space. And if you're joining us for the first time, or if you've been a long-time listener, we would love your ratings and your reviews, and your 5-star ratings and 5-star reviews, because that really helps us promote the podcast and get it out there and help to educate more and more people about the world of process. There are many people out there that are interested in this topic, in this space, and who better to learn from than those that are successfully doing it. And obviously success does come with challenges and hurdles and obstacles and things like that. But one thing I've learned is that success leaves clues. So if we can learn from those that have been successful with it, we can also pave our own path in the BPM space. And in today's episode, it's a little bit of a different one, different in one sense, but I have had this guest on before. We've got Mirko Kloppenburg joining us on today's podcast, and he has been in the series before, where we dived into a bit more about his history in the process space, and things that's worked for him, challenge that he's faced and overcome as well. And but in today's episode, I want to introduce you to Mirko Kloppenburg, the podcast host. Mirko also runs his own podcast on the topic of business process management, and so because we're all about bringing more BPM education to our Process Pioneers audience, I actually want to open your world up to a whole nother podcast that dives into this topic as well, and you'll get to learn a whole lot more from that audience as well. But enough from me. Mirko, thank you so much for joining me. This is going to be a great conversation.
Thank you so much, Daniel, for inviting me for the second time. I think the first time was about 2 years ago, and a lot of things happened in between. So I'm really looking forward to this session today.
That's awesome. Fantastic. And since then, you obviously, as I mentioned, you kickstarted your own podcast series on the process space. Tell us a little bit about the motivation and the drive to start a podcast of this nature, and give us maybe a little bit of an overview. I think you're up to episode 34 or thereabouts at the moment. Yeah. Give us a little bit of a recap or overview as to the journey so far.
Yeah, sure. So I think I dreamed of having my own podcast since I listened to the first podcast on my own about, 15 years ago. So I was listening there quite often to podcasts, and I thought, one day I'm going to have my own podcast. I don't know why, and I never knew about which topic. And it was so obvious because I was working in process management for years. And finally, last year, I launched my own podcast. It's the New Process Podcast. It's my vehicle to rethink processes, to talk to experts from other disciplines, to learn from their experience, and then transfer their ideas onto process management. So that's basically the core of the most of the episodes there.
That's awesome. That's great. And out of your 34 episodes, I mean, that you've got some incredible names that you've managed to get onto the podcast and interview about their background, their history and expertise. Is there one that stands out in particular?
I would say it depends. So for sure, one of the last interviews was with Will van der Aalst, and that was super exciting. And I would say I was a little bit nervous to talk to the godfather of process mining. That was super cool, and I really love the insights he provided to the podcast. But with regards to the content, there were some other episodes which I really enjoyed. Talking about content creation was super cool. Process strategy, gamification, community building. So there were a lot of episodes which I really enjoyed. With regards to expert interviews. And then I'm also doing right now a series of interviews to find a human-centric BPM tool, because I'm really fighting for the people aspects in BPM, and I'm looking for a tool. I also talked to Mark Stromberg already to have a look onto BIG. That was super interesting. So it really depends. And in the end, there is always something which I really love about the interview. So there is not the one and only episode. There are a lot of episodes that I really love.
That's great. That's awesome. And would you say that there has been anything that stood out to you in the sense of that it's been a reoccurring theme? So when you've been having these conversations, are you noticing anything that is reoccurring, that often organizations are facing similar challenges or tackling similar problems when trying to implement business process management? Is there anything that seems to reoccur, or is it very different depending on who you talk to?
It depends. So within the tool interviews, I would say the biggest challenge of nearly all the vendors out there is that they started to develop an expert tool. And none of the tools was developed with the real employee, the user in mind. And that's a real challenge. I would say that's something which reoccurs from tool interview to interview. But with regards to the expert interviews, when we're talking about different methodologies, I think often we come to the point where we talk about communication. So involving the people and integrate them into the activity. So I would say these softer aspects, that's what nearly all the experts recommend. For sure, it definitely makes sense to do that. But that's something which is often forgotten in process management. So especially when you're an expert and you are so deep in the process design, you sometimes forget the people. And this is what I'm fighting for. So make sure that you communicate openly what you're doing, invite the people to participate, and so on. So that's really important, and that's one thing that nearly all the participants of the podcasts in the end also recommend, because I'm doing a quite structured interview with the same check-in and landing question. So it's more like a flight that we are having there. And there's always the question, what are your top recommendations based on all your learnings? And often one of these top recommendations is communication, change aspects, take the people in mind, and so on. So that's for sure something which definitely makes sense.
Yeah. I guess it's a very interesting space or interesting role to be in the sense that it both can be highly technical, highly analytical, highly mathematical from a process point of view, but also highly there is very much that human element to it, where emotional intelligence and high EQ is necessary. But I guess when you think of the traditional sense of the word, or when you think of a process, it doesn't sound so much human interaction, and so it probably isn't going to just on a surface level isn't going to attract that sort of person that loves human interaction and understanding psychology and the way that people think and what motivates and drives people. It's probably going to attract more people with an analytical process kind of lens. Is that what you've kind of experienced?
Yeah. And I'd say most of the interview partners are male. That's a real problem within the BPM world. It's dominated by men, unfortunately. But I did some super interesting interviews with experts from other disciplines, female. One was about story listening. Have you ever heard about story listening as a technique? So that's also a very structured approach to discover the emotions of the people. And we try to apply that to process modeling sessions as well. And the idea, if you transfer that to process management or process modeling, for example, was to ask the people about their stories that they experienced while, for example, executing the process. So tell me these interesting stories when you executed the process for the last time, and what were your feelings there? And what do you talk about emotions? So to get to these more softer topics. And I really love that. And more or less as a running gag, I think at the end of my workshops, I always ask the people, how do you feel now? So with what kind of emotions are you leaving the meeting? And I really love that as a technical guy, because for me, it's just a process. And if the process design is good enough, everything is fine. But there are people and they have emotions. And I really love to ask this question and to find out how do the people feel. So that's super interesting to learn more from other experts. And story listening was one of the topics I never heard of before, and that was an episode in the beginning of this year, and that was cool.
That's awesome. That's great. Well, for those that are listening, if you haven't jumped onto the New Process podcast that Mirko hosts, then I'd encourage you to go find it on Spotify, on Apple, on all of the different podcast channels, wherever you can find it. Go listen to it, because there's a bunch of very insightful episodes there. And it's interesting that you're saying, that it's quite male dominated, because I would agree in the sense that I would say for the most part that's been my experience. But I'm actually currently in Auckland in New Zealand. I just came over here for the week, and I'm just meeting with different process specialists and practitioners and experts. And I had it's the start of the week, and I had a ton of meetings on today. And they were all female today. And
that's very good. Yeah, cool.
Yeah, and I was I wasn't really thinking when I was booking it in, but now that you mention it, I was like, I'm thinking through, and I'm like, all of the and these are heads of center of process excellence. These are cool. These are people that are really dominating in this space. So it is fantastic to see, because I think the whole human element to it, it's something that's so important. And I think that's something I noticed in the women that I met with today, is that's something that they are so skilled at. That's comes second nature to them, or it feels like it at least. And I could only imagine that would bring a whole lot of value and trying to bring people along the journey, because as we both know, when it comes to process management, processes touch every person in an organization, from your senior leaders to your frontline operational employees. And that's a whole lot of people we've got to bring on this on this process journey. So we need to know how to work with them. Absolutely. Yeah. So tell us about the process of putting on your podcast. I think, it's I guess a little bit of an obscure question, unusual question for the types of questions that I normally like to ask on this podcast. But seeing as I'm talking to another podcast host, walk us through what is the process. But we might have some people in our community that have also had a dream of, I want to start a podcast one day, but what does it actually look like? So can you walk us through your process for creating a world-class podcast? Thanks. So I'm still working on that, but as I already said, for me, it's more or less a vehicle to explore other disciplines and to transfer these ideas onto process management. So that's why I have my very own agenda on whom to interview. And I'm still producing more or less just in time. And I often ask my guests for recommendations for people to talk to. And this then influences my journey, what I'm exploring at the moment.
And I really love this part of the process. So I don't have a plan for the next half year on interviews. I have a very long, I would say, waiting list of people I would love to talk to, but I'm still trying to figure out which episode fits next to what we talked about today and so on. So, and as soon as I have a person expert I would love to talk to, I just approach them and ask them, tell them what I'm doing, ask them if they would like to share their experience in a New Process podcast. And I would say in 95% they agree. Sometimes they are a little bit skeptical because of the fact that I'm doing the interviews in English. And a lot of my guests are not English native speakers. So for them, it's always a challenge, for me as well. And but then I always prepare a guideline. I'm a very structured guy, a process management guy. And my episodes are more like a flight. So we're starting with a check-in. There are always 3 questions which I'm asking all the time. And then we slowly start the flight. And when we come to the cruise altitude, then we go really deep into the topic the expert is an expert in. And then we go into landing and deboard the aircraft. So that's basically the flight, what I'm doing. And since this January, I'm then afterwards handing over the recording files to a company which is supporting me because it's super time consuming to do the podcast. So in the beginning, it took me about, I checked that afterwards, about 2 days to prepare, record, process, and then communicate an episode. And that's a lot of time, but it's also a lot of fun. But now I'm handing over the parts which are highly standardized to other people so that I can focus more on the interview itself. And that's super interesting. I think it's always good to have a nice recording setup, a good microphone, and I'm also using these in-ear headphones there, which I really like.
Cool. Are they like musician, like in-ears or something?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Do you have a secret side hobby as a musician or artist?
No, I don't. No, my only hobby is BPM. but as you said in before we started the recording, I'm sometimes a little bit perfectionist, and this is also part of that. Have a good sound in the recording as well.
Yeah, that's awesome.
But I had some recordings with, I would say, a lot of room for improvement for the sound on the guest side. And I'm super thankful for the guys editing my recordings that they always made it to get a good quality out of the recording. So that's not so hard or not so sad if the recording of the audio of the guest is not the best. But in the end, it hopefully works out. So. Yeah, just try it out. If you like to start your own podcast, you just have to try it out. It's super easy with all the remote setups that we are having right now, and just go for it.
Totally. And I've heard that, I think that I've heard the average the average podcast only lasts about 7 episodes, I think it is, on average. And I think a lot of people get super excited about creating a podcast and producing the podcast and they want it to be good. They want it to look good. They want it to sound good. They want it to be an awesome experience. But I think what happens is they'll produce a couple of episodes or up to 7 episodes or maybe a little bit more for some, and they'll realize how much time, effort, and energy it takes to produce something of a highest quality. And so I guess for me and the Process Pioneers podcast, for us, it's been about how can we produce get the maximum outcome with as minimal input as possible. And I guess in a funny way, it's somewhat similar to the work we're doing in the process space, is, looking at our processes being like, okay, which process is going to give us the biggest return for the smallest kind of input. And it's so for us, I think, I was doing my first interviews, although I probably wouldn't call them podcasts necessarily, but about 10 years ago, I think I started doing my first interviews. It was still in the business world, but just a slightly different angle. And back then I remember hiring out camera gear and lighting and sound and all the gear, and I'd be traveling from office to office to office, like meeting people in person. I'd be flying halfway across our country to Sydney and Melbourne, which over here in this country, that's it's a long flight, just to sit down with people and record one interview with them, and it just I didn't that one actually went. I did actually produce quite a lot of episodes in that one. I think I if I was traveling to Sydney or Melbourne, or I'd try and pack in my days. Like I'd be doing an interview on the hour, every hour, with an hour gap in between to get to my next one, and I'd come home with a hard drive full of episodes. And then actually when I started the Process Pioneers podcast, it was in end of 2019, start of 2020, I think it was. And I flew to Sydney with all my gear, which I hired the gear. And I think I'd booked in 3 interviews, for one day, or maybe across 2 days. One of them cancelled on me last minute, because something comes up, and that's what happens. It is what it is. And the other 2 I got to record, but one of them, the audio wasn't set properly, and it was just totally distorted and just unusable. So I came home from this flights and accommodation and trip to Sydney, and I only had one episode that really was usable. And then the pandemic hit a couple of weeks later, and I was like, oh, what are the chances? Like I've done one episode, and I won't be able to do any more. And then that's where I turned my attention to platforms like Zoom and doing it virtually. And then I realized I actually don't need an hour gap in between podcasts anymore. I could knock out 8 episodes in one day. And I think my most has probably been 6 episodes or something. Wow. And then the team was saying, hey, slow down. Like you've given us enough podcasts to release, one a week for the next 6 months or something. So, but yeah, it's there's many things that can be out of your control, I guess. In a long story short, there are a lot of things that can be out of your control, and sometimes it's hard to navigate that. I think in the early days, for some of them, I was even like posting a little microphone in the mail to my guests, but again, not super sustainable. But I think these days everyone's on Zoom, everyone's on Teams, everyone's got half decent microphones and things like that. But jumping back to the new Process podcast, do you have any? Are there any funny moments in the, like it's not the funniest topic, it's quite a serious topic, but were there any funny moments or any moments that were a curveball for you that you weren't expecting?
A lot with regards to the tools. For example, there are always super interesting features I never heard about. So I've been a user of Aris in the past, and I was working with their version, 7 something, somewhere 10, 15 years ago. And then I realized that we already have Aris 10, I think. We joked if there is Aris 11 now already coming up and so on. So that was a super funny interview to learn more about the tools, which I have been using in the past, and see how they develop, for example. Another cool moment for me was when I was a guest in another video podcast, which I recorded from our caravan. So I was at the Baltic Sea for 2 days, just me and my strategy. And I often use the time to really deep dive into my strategy topics. And but there was this recording planned, and I was sitting in this Volkswagen California caravan, recording that from the Baltic Sea. That was also nice to be in another surrounding. luckily it all worked well with the connection and so. Yeah, there are a lot of cool stories which I experienced based on the podcast.
That's awesome. That's awesome. I was actually catching up with someone today, and I asked them if they'd like to be in the podcast, because she is the chapter lead of Process at a large bank here in New Zealand. And she watches the podcast and loves watching the episodes, and I wanted to have her on this series as well. And I also mentioned that, I'm doing a bit of traveling coming up. I'm going to be visiting Germany and Italy and Croatia. And then she was saying like, oh, we should do the episode where you're like on the edge of the Adriatic Sea there, or on a boat somewhere, like you're on a boat doing the podcast. And I think she was thinking she would be there as well, and just in the sand, kicking back, like talking about Process. But I don't know if we'll be able to make that happen, and I don't know how happy my wife will be if I'm doing podcast recordings on our family holidays. So I don't know whether that will happen.
I had the same with a guest where we joked about, because I was flying to Florida with the family for a 1 week vacation a few months ago. And we said, yeah, we can do the recording while I'm sitting at the pool having a cocktail. And he's just in Munich, where it's still quite cold at that time. But my wife was not so excited about that. So
yes.
postponed the recording.
Yes, 100%. Yeah. So obviously doing your podcast, you're all about educating people on the process space, not from a theoretical point of view, but let's learn from those practitioners that have been there and done that, and kind of have implemented BPM successfully. You obviously wouldn't hear from every listener you wouldn't get feedback from every listener, but I know for the Process Pioneers podcast, we've over time we've received a bit of a stream of feedback, and I'm not really expecting it, but it is very exciting when I get to hear of how through the Process Pioneers podcast we enabled someone to move from Amsterdam to Australia and pick up a process job because they connected with someone on the podcast series. And there was another story where a lady was working in the process space for a large software company, like a financial software company. And she was as far as she was aware, she was the only person in that organization that understood process. And she was actually about to leave the BPM space because she said, no one understands this. No one values this. Like, it just feels like an uphill battle. And then she stumbled across the podcast series. I think she stumbled across it, or maybe I reached out to her or something. But she said since she's seen the podcast episodes and have been able to listen to other process practitioners and even connect with some of them virtually, she realized she found her people. She found her people that think the same, that breathe the same, that live the same, and that was enough for her to be like, I want to stay in this BPM space, and she's still at the same organization, and they're seeing so much success there now because of what she's been able to implement, and I would say part of that is because of what she's been able to learn through the podcast series. So all of that to say, what kind of reception, what kind of feedback have you heard from your audience, whether people personally or whether it's people that you don't know that have kind of sent you a message?
Yeah. And first, I have to say that podcast for me is basically a one-way communication vehicle at the moment. And that's super sad because you normally don't get direct feedback. But I think it's often very unexpected that people then approach you and tell, Mirko, I listened to this and that episode and it was super interesting and we tried that out and so on. So that definitely happens, but it's often weeks later. So sometimes it's on the same day when I release an episode, but in most cases, it's some months in between until the people say, yeah, I listened to that episode and tried this and that. And one example, so there is one guy out there he's also quite active in the LinkedIn bubble right now. He started a new position, and the episode with Martin Holing. I'm going to release that episode end of July. And there we are reviewing all the tool interviews. And he was BPM pro within the Siemens world for years, or nearly for 20 years, I would say. And now he started a new job in a small company, and he wanted to see, what is going on there? What are the latest ideas? And he found the podcast, and he listened to the latest episodes at that point in time, and said, wow, that's exactly what I'm doing, and I have to learn more. And then he commented on LinkedIn, and we got into contact, and he's one of the listeners. He then started to listen from episode 1. So he listened to all 30 something episodes, which are out there right now. And that's super cool. If you get feedback like this, it doesn't have to be that the people listen to all episodes, but from time to time I get emails or messages on LinkedIn where the people say, can we have a closer look onto that? That's super interesting. We tried this and that. One episode I recorded on content creation, and we talked about being a process influencer in your organization. So use the tools of the influencers out there and apply that to BPM, like starting your own process podcast internally. I'm currently doing that with one of my customers, and that's super cool to talk to process architects or the participants of process modeling sessions, ask them for their experiences. What do they think about what they felt during the podcast? Or also ask for their feelings and then share that on internal media, or even do it publicly if the company is really brave with regards to communication. Sometimes they also think about opening up this internal podcast to the outside world, and that's super cool. So I can only recommend to the people out there, just provide feedback. If there is something which you would like to have a closer look onto, always feel free to contact me. I think it's the same for you as well. It's always good to have this deep dive afterwards and so on.
Yeah. No, I love that. I've never heard of that idea before, which is fantastic. I've certainly heard different people starting their own like community of practices internally, but having a podcast to be able to share these stories, I think is fantastic, because especially now where for some organizations, it's getting FaceTime with other people can be somewhat difficult because different people are coming into the office on different days, and so having a podcast where you celebrate the work, I think that's a huge part of it. Like there are organizations that I work directly with, and that's a common topic that comes up is we need to promote this across the organization. How do we market this? We need to be marketers. We need to be salespeople. How do we sell this concept, this idea across the organization? How are we best to do that? How are we best to influence people? How do we bring them on the journey and make them feel real, like part of it, and make them buy into it? And I think, a podcast is a fantastic way of doing that. So that's great. I wanted to ask you, Mirko, we've touched on a couple of the episodes, but just for my audience, the Process Pioneers audience to understand, I just wanted to kind of fire at you a few different topics, and if you can shoot back like which episode they should start with. I'm sure that for every topic there's a bunch of episodes they could listen to, but maybe just the first one that comes to your mind. So let's and if there isn't one, then that's okay. And maybe someone from my audience will reach out and make a recommendation. So let's start with process architecture.
Oh, I'm a process modeling nerd, I think. I did an interview with Kevin Tan on processability. That we talked a lot about modeling, visual balance, and I really love this. For me, process modeling is an art, definitely. So that's something with regards to process architecture or process modeling. And I talked to a real process architect. Yeah.
Okay.
So that's an interview with Christoph Bunker. Unfortunately, I don't know the number of the episode right now. It was released in November last year, I think. So 2002, 2022. And would have been a quite long history if that was 20 years ago.
Yes.
No, it was just last November. And that was an interesting episode because he is heading a team of actually a number of process architects for a logistic process at Lufthansa. And that was also super interesting to learn about what a process architect is doing. Yeah.
That's awesome. I don't know Christoph, but I know Kevin, and we've had Kevin on our podcast as well. Kevin's fantastic. Process governance and ownership.
I think Michael Bögle, he was my former boss at Lufthansa. He's now head of management system there and also for the authorities of the Lufthansa Technik Group. And we have a quite long history on governance topics like how to define the role of a process owner, how to interact with the people out there. So that was one of the earlier episodes, summer last year. I don't remember the number, but maybe we can put that into the show notes afterwards.
Yes, yeah. Customer experience.
I think I haven't had a real interview on customer experience. I did one on process innovation with Nelson Inno. That was super interesting there to innovate processes, always also with the customer in mind. Cut the process into pieces. That's something I remember there on how to innovate that. So invite the people, maybe also customers, to a workshop and then see how to rethink the process.
That's awesome. Process mining.
Will van der Aalst, which was one of the latest episodes. Yeah, just godfather of process mining. Nothing to add. But there we also talked about AI a little bit. So that's super interesting. And I recorded an episode on AI with Benjamin Duhont a few weeks ago. And that was a cool thing. I think I have to share that here. Then we talked about how can AI help us BPM guys. And we were talking about Copilot just to generate ideas. And after I released that episode, I got a message from another vendor. And he said, "Hey, Mirko, we are doing this already." And then we recorded a short video where he showcased how they transfer a process model from their tool to ChatGPT, and ChatGPT then creates recommendations on how to improve the process. And this Friday, I received a message and a screenshot from him where he said, "We improved the prompt, and now the recommendations from ChatGPT are so super cool." And I looked at that, and yeah, it's definitely super interesting. So there is a lot of cool stuff coming up with regards to AI, and we'll see how this will work out.
Yeah, it's definitely an exciting future there, and I think that there are going to be many software and technology companies that are going to be, pioneering this space. Because whoever brings out something that is hyper valuable to organizations, they're going to almost create the new normal, and the other software companies, the other technologies will, be playing catch up. So it's certainly going to be a very interesting next 2 to 5 years. Change management.
It's a lot about change. I think I haven't recorded a real change management episode, but I did an interview with Ole Tillmann on how to pitch your process. So how to sell what you're doing. And that's a lot about involving the people, getting them excited about what you're doing. So for me, communication is a big part of change itself. So I think basically most of the episodes somehow relate to change management in the end.
Yes. Yeah, fantastic. No, that's great. No, that's awesome. Well, thanks for that. For those that are listening, you can see right there that there's a bunch of episodes filled with valuable insights, and obviously they're it's not they're not like one day masterclasses. It's a podcast episode. How long do your podcasts go for on average, Mirko?
45 to 60 minutes.
45, 60.
I try to stay under an hour.
Yeah, so you're kind of scraping the surface there, but obviously these topics are huge, and there's a lot to it. But I think that's the goal. Is we want to we're educating in bite-sized chunks and producing content that is you're able to go and watch it and rewatch it and go back and drill down into very specific topics. So I think it's fantastic. But for our process practitioners that are listening, as a final question, as a last question, what should they be prioritizing right now to prepare them for the future? Because I know some organizations, I suppose in Europe, I would say the level of process maturity is more mature than, say, in other parts of the world, or maybe in particular Germany, I would say. That's just an assumption, but so for people that are in this space or entering into this space, what's the most valuable tool they need to have in their tool belt? And I'm not saying tool as in like software or technology. I'm talking about gifts or talents or skills. What should they be focusing on right now?
Technical wise, I think process mining is for sure one of the tools you have to look onto, and then automation and so on, and also AI. These are the hot topics, which are doing a quite good job for the BPM guys out there, because they bring BPM also on the radar of top management. That definitely helps. But my top recommendation is don't forget the people. So right from the beginning, tell your community, or first define the community. Yeah, find out what is your community with regards to BPM in an organization from an overall perspective, or if you're just accountable for a specific process, think about your community and tell them what you're going to do. Invite them to participate. And for me, the superpower is invite them to a process purpose workshop. Really bring the people together and think about, why are you doing this? What is this process for? And define that. Bring in the values of the people, try to contribute to the purpose of the organization, and start to create your process community, which is then always trying to contribute to this process purpose. So it's a very soft topic. Maybe it's a little bit spooky if you're a more technical guy to think about purpose of a process and talk about feelings and emotions. But this is definitely a superpower, which I can recommend to have a closer look onto. Yeah.
That's awesome. Well, you've heard... Yeah, yep. Sorry.
By the way, there was a podcast episode. I did an interview with Benjamin Rolf, and I also have a solo episode on process purpose. I think it's episode 3, 4, 5. It was really in the beginning of my journey, and that's a good starting point. And that's my recommendation to the people out there. Think about how to involve your process community.
That's awesome. That's so good. Well, for everyone listening, you have heard it here first. You need to be aware and mindful and considerate that you're working with people. So you need to improve those people skills and know how to bring people along the journey. You don't have an excuse anymore. Mirko has just laid that out flat, bare for us. He's told us we need to be mindful and of the people, which I fully agree and believe in. Yeah. And I think it's something that the audience needs to do as well. So Mirko, I just want to thank you for sitting down with me in this quite a unique episode of Process Pioneers. It's somewhat unusual in contrast to the other episodes, but really I'm glad that we were able to introduce our community to your community or to your podcast. And I'm sure a lot of them are going to jump across onto the new Process podcast on any of the channels that you watch or listen to your podcasts on, because I know that we both have a similar goal in mind of, educating people in the process space. We want to help people successfully implement BPM, sustainably implement BPM. So if we can send our audience your way, then that's a win in my eyes. So Mirko, I just want to thank you so much for sitting down with me. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Yeah, thank you so much, Daniel, for inviting me for the second time. And we just have to join forces because the BPM community is quite small out there, and maybe it was somehow inspiring for your listeners as well. So I'm looking forward to the third recording in about 2 or 3 years.